The noise has been growing for years about the sense that social media is doing us harm in all sorts of ways, but particularly it's doing our children harm in their formative years when they should be learning all sorts of useful things like how to focus and how to overcome challenges. They're instead spending all their time absorbing content that trains them to have the shortest possible attention spans, encourages them to compare themselves to impossible dream figures, to look up to dystopian role models, and of course to feel badly about themselves in all sorts of inventive ways. And for years, we had the sense that was happening. Occasionally, you'd hear about research that rather confirmed that it was happening, but nobody seemed to believe that anything could really be done to stop it happening, other than governments badgering the social media companies to somehow police themselves a bit better, or else. When the head teacher of Michaela's school in the United Kingdom, Catherine Burblesing, banned all children from having mobile phones while they were at school a couple of years ago, she was labelled the country's strictest head teacher and she was pilloried for being so unreasonable. But then the school started to achieve amongst the best results in the country, so gradually others started to follow suit. Now, the government of Australia has gone somewhat more radical. Last week, it introduced a bill to ban all children from accessing social media full stop. Now, this is either the first break in the dam, as adults step in to prevent one of the worst societal acts of self-harm in the history of the species, or it's massive government overreach, with disturbing implications for privacy and free speech and a lot more besides. I mean, technically, I suppose it could be both at the same time. So let's have a look, both because what's happening is interesting and also because, well, a lot of governments and state governors are watching this experiment closely, and it might be coming closer to home to you, depending on how it all plays out. First of all, is this even a real problem? As far as the research goes, the answer seems to be reasonably likely yes. Randomised trials have been carried out where young people were split into two groups, one which used social media as usual, another of which had that usage significantly reduced for a few weeks. The reduced use group shows fewer signs of loneliness, fewer signs of depression. The headline was that a limited amount of social media use could be positive, but left to their own devices, literally, kids don't limit their use that much at all. More than 1 hour of use per day was strongly correlated with negative outcomes for them. Now, there's been some pushback, some people think it's more complicated, but there is a reasonable evidence base. So the bill introduced in Australia, it's not the first in the world to bring in age-related restrictions, but it is arguably the most radical. And unlike some other such bills, it will literally rip the services out of the hands of even existing young users. Some countries allow children to have access so long as they have parental consent. No such provision here. Facebook will be included, which presumably is not much of an issue because do young people even use Facebook anymore? But they will care more about the fact that Instagram and TikTok will be included. Twitter and its various clones also included, but again, unlikely to be the service that prompts the loudest howls of pain and outrage. It won't apply to gaming, probably not YouTube, although there's some ambiguity there. The law will require the companies to use a robust age verification system to block children from accessing the services. Such verification, of course, is not easy. While Australian lawmakers know that, just like prohibiting the sale of alcohol to minors, there will always be some who, on occasion, manage to get around those restrictions, the fact that it will be illegal will push usage right down. because parents will know it's illegal, schools will know it's illegal, the amount of time available for children to access the services surreptitiously will likely shrink accordingly, even if they manage for however long to get past the age verification systems. And since only some of their friends will likewise be successful, and all of them will be trying not to seem like they're the age that they actually are, it will strongly reduce the incentive to dodge those barriers anyway. Because after all, the lure of social media is that all of your friends are to be found there. If very few of them actually then make it, kind of what's the point? So far it seems that the Australian public is broadly in favour of the ban. According to a YouGov survey carried out this year, 61% of Australians support restricting access to social media to those younger than 17 years old. Support indeed is so strong that the opposition party fell in line behind the bill. So, no reason for any controversy then, you might think. Except, of course, when you get into the detail of how that age verification thing is going to work. Australia is looking at several methods. One is to use a government ID system. Another would be to use biometric data. Australia's e-safety commissioner recommended a double-blind tokenized approach, which you may think sounds a bit like a bunch of old gobbledygook. In theory, this means that you can have the system work without the potential privacy concerns. Another possible approach would be to use an algorithm to identify age-related patterns in user behaviour. Underage kids tend to interact online in ways that are identifiably different to how adults behave. An algorithm can be trained to detect those differences in user behaviour. Another option is to use facial scanning from the device's camera, using an algorithm again to determine the likely age of the user based on their image. Bad news if you're one of those people who looks younger than they actually are, I guess. Fairly sure I would get away with it, but you never know. And possibly bad news for a lot more people besides. Some critics of the bill started to ask the question, so if young people have to scan their faces, then doesn't that mean that all Australians will have to be prepared to do this when they use social media, or else to provide documentation to a government database that can be used as the basis for verification? And this, of course, is where people start to raise the alarm, alleging that the scheme de facto requires the introduction of a government ID scheme mandatory, covering all citizens, and however that's set up now, and whatever this first use case may or may not be, once it's there, it will spread to other issues, other use cases. Digital rights campaigner Meredith Whittaker told the Sydney Morning Herald, banning people under 16 from using social media will not work. It would basically be creating a system to monitor internet usage at a whole population scale, because you can't know that someone is over the age of 17 without checking everyone. Bear in mind, maybe this remains an utterly benign proposition under the Australian government's past and present. Some people will have strong views on that matter, but, maybe it will be. You nevertheless establish the principle that will become normalised and then taken up by countries where people posting openly on social media can earn them a prison sentence or worse. This comes at the same time as Australia is introducing a voluntary digital ID scheme, Trust Exchange, or TEX. This will operate through digital wallets, which means that users can verify their identity and credentials using official information held by the government. And yes, the aim is that TEX will be able to verify age without exchanging any personal information at the point of use. So, if challenged about your age in a pub, for instance, you present your phone to a QR code and it sends a digital token, the only information which is to confirm your age. A system that's supposed to make the exchange hacker proof, although we've heard claims like that before. But even if that's true, even if the software element of this is flawlessly elegant, one thing it won't be is disinformation proof. A few stories circulating social media about the source code having been reviewed and there's a massive government designed loophole to enable them to, well, use your imagination. Because such stories have become inevitable for every single event or initiative that comes along. And so that essential ingredient of trust needed for these systems to work seems a very fragile thing. Speaking of disinformation, it's also worth mentioning that the Albanese government in Australia also tried to bring in a disinformation bill, which of course is where you do wade into much more controversial territory over what is or is not free speech. That initiative got the pushback that you might expect. It was labelled as heavy-handed and authoritarian. No one on the opposition side was going to support that one, and it was withdrawn. One indicator that the absence of trust remains a formidable hurdle in any of this kind of legislation. It does seem at the moment that the social media ban for children will go ahead thanks to the significant public support. If people believe something to be intuitively true, that can trump evidence that reports to the contrary according to the data. Now, I don't consider that to be a good thing, but it's the case. When you get both the intuition and the evidence lining up together, well, it's hard to see that not actually finding its way into actual law. Now, obviously, the social media platforms are pushing back. Also, obviously, people in the age range actually covered, not wholly in favour, although actually it's much closer than you would think, with just 54% opposed. Neither of those are likely to derail the attempt, and at that point you can bet your life that every other government across the world is going to be watching, taking copious notes over what happens next. Unless this law crashes and burns in spectacular fashion, start counting off the days until a version of it first starts to be floated as something that your own government would like to be looking carefully into. Would you welcome that, or would you line up with the protests against it? Let me know what you think in the comments below.